Hello everyone and welcome to this panel, Data Centers of the Future. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the panelists. My name is Ed Ansett from i3 Solutions Group. So let me introduce the panelists, and if I could start with Gordon, please.
Hello, I'm Gordon Hollingsworth. I'm an Executive Director with Jones Lang LaSalle, and I focus on engineering services. Thanks,
Gordon. Nick?
Hi, I'm Nick Vaney. I'm the Chief Technical Officer of RED. I've been involved in the design of data centers for the last 30 years or so, with a real sort of passion towards driving good data center design and in particular energy efficient cooling systems.
And Ed, please.
Hi, I'm Ed Vigor-Messenger. I'm a Principal Mechanical Consultant, consulting into Deerns, UK. Again, similar to Nick, I've been in the industry a long time, but maybe not as long as Nick. I have a passion too, mechanically wise, to reduce energy usage and carbon footprints from data centers.
Thank you. And Kevin?
Hi everyone, I'm Kevin Burke. I'm Associate Mechanical Engineer in the Arup Cardiff office. I lead one of Arup's Centre of Excellence data centre teams from there. We've got 400 data centre professionals across the UK, Ireland, Germany, Denmark, Poland, and a number of other countries across Europe. We focus on a broad range of building engineering services, project management and specialist services as well, such as transaction advice.
Thanks, Kevin. And finally, Andy.
Yeah, hello, I'm Andy Humble. I work for a company called Metnor Construction. Position at Metnor is Head of Special Projects, and we manage the data center side of the business. Metnor has been involved with data centers for approximately 12 years now. We deal from everything from shell and core construction site to the full fit out. And just come from a contracting background, we may be able to offer something a little bit more on the delivery side of the being focused on this call.
Thanks, Andy. Right, so I'm going to start the questions and initially went to ask the panelists individually, generally speaking, some of these questions. So let me start with you, Gordon, if I could. Gordon, what are you seeing? What are you seeing from clients that have got significant data center space that have already set public targets for being carbon neutral in the next 10 years? Can you tell us what you're seeing in that respect, please?
Yeah, so over recent years, a lot of clients have been focused around their asset inventory, getting good databases, and it's actually put them in a great position to look at forming the roadmap and determining the investments that they're going to make within their own business to drive energy efficient initiatives, asset replacement strategies, so they can forecast that going forward. And with that visibility, they're able to then get the sponsorship of the internal execs to a long-term strategy. And through that process, I would hope to see that they would plan new innovation, new products and optimization of infrastructure that's going to drive those measures. Obviously, that doesn't get you to carbon neutral, but as a starting point, you invest in your own business to be able to grow it. And then obviously you look at other measures, including offsetting and so on and so forth.
Right. I mean, is that the target this next 10 years or so in terms of carbon neutrality? Is that a sort of target that organizations are using?
I think there's a lot of investment commitments, and I think although some organizations have sort of said they've achieved carbon neutral, I think within the data center environments that's not really the case, and I think they're going to have to plan the spend given the size of and the complexity of the infrastructures that we're looking at. When you look at other clients as well, they're probably coming up to a point, if you look at who went first in kind of the big data center markets, predominantly the financial sectors, but there are others behind them as well. So they're coming up to that life cycle replacement point now. So they're going to have to plan for those investments now. And we're talking about quite significant investments to try to drive those efficiencies. And some clients will, I think this may promote more migration of services to colos and the big hyperscale data centers in the future.
Okay, when you say significant investments, what kind of level of investment? Can you give us an example, perhaps without naming any company names, but perhaps a good
well, investment's obviously going to range on the size of your portfolio, but you're certainly looking at, for a big organisation, big corporate organisation, tens of millions per annum over the next 10 years. And of course, that depends where you are in your cycle currently now. Okay, so that would be driven by your asset databases. But when you're looking at things like chillers and generators and UPS investments, and you look at the project costs that go with the implementation of those, we are talking significant costs.
Okay. Hey, Kevin, just wanted to turn to you now because we're on the subject of sustainability. I mean, what do you think are the key considerations for the industry, you know, in the future? I know that's a very general question, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think there has been a focus on energy in particular over the last few years, and the carbon emissions related to that. And I think you'll have seen, especially over recent months, the likes of Google, Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, Facebook and Apple, all making very big commitments to be carbon free by 2030 or omit diesel generators from their estate of data centers. So huge commitments over the next 10 years. I think the focus is generally, as I said, been on the energy side of things, but I'd suggest that over the next 10 years, it needs to shift into the broader sustainability agenda. I think they've recognized energy is a large proportion of that, but it's not the only element of it. Water, for instance, is another one. In Arup, we talk a lot about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I think there are a number of those goals which data center organizations can directly align with.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Kevin. We're going to come back to you on a similar topic in a short while. Andy, I just want to bring you into this now. I mean, Andy's obviously, your background is contracting. You know, typically the contractor's voice isn't heard in these type of discussions. So I'm obviously very pleased that you're on the panel. Can you give us some examples of topics that you'd like to see addressed by people like us and our organisations?
I mean, like you said, I think a lot of the time, by the time a contractor gets involved with a project, the discussions on design and sustainability on the end product is kind of been and gone, and we're dealt with the stage 3 design that we've got at hand. Although I do think there are definitely benefits of having contractor influence at an earlier stage. I mean, just for example, that could be alternative suppliers out there that we're aware of that we've used in the past that haven't already been considered. So it's getting to the point where there is actually a window of opportunity to allow the contractor to try to influence how the design goes and which suppliers are being used. A lot of the time, program doesn't allow that to happen. And by the time we are actually in contract, we're kind of running 100 miles an hour to get the job where it needs to be and get the job commenced. So just looking beyond that and items that are within our control is one thing that I think this whole pandemic, which nobody can ignore and everybody's living through at the moment, is we've got probably blue sky thinking that was happening 10 years ago that nobody's really embraced. And we're now kind of being forced into using these new technologies, or I say new technologies, technologies that have been there for a long time, that not just our industry, but I think a lot of businesses worldwide haven't been utilising.
Right. I mean, just staying with you for a minute on, you know, there's another point here. And what do you see the role of BIM in terms of how it's going to practically affect construction over the next few years? I mean, a lot of people are using BIM now. I mean, how effective is it in terms of transfer from consultant to contractor and operations in your experience?
Yeah, it's really important. And again, I know BIM's been around for years, and I just don't think it hasn't been embraced correctly. The benefits of BIM are huge. I mean, being able to minimise the risk and the actual on-site build is huge. I mean, one thing we're implementing at the moment is 4D planning, and just being able to actually see how the project goes together from an early concept stage is absolutely massive for how it's going to be delivered. Again, it's getting to that point where then benefits are recognised and everybody's working to that uniform goal of making sure BIM is implemented on all projects going forward.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Nick, Ed, let's just come on to you. What's your views on that subject of BIM and its practical implementation? Or either of you, Nick or Ed?
Myself, at the moment, I feel that the BIM is a useful tool, and there's some great work being done by designers, but that seems to get lost when it goes to construction, and a model has to be either rebuilt or rehatched by someone else. Now, I see the future of BIM as being that the consultants, their final design is effectively the final design that can be built to. Okay, you may need to add in the bracketry and the niceties of services that we can't drill down that far. But that base model is 3/4 done, it's there, it could almost be built to. And that's what I feel how BIM should be working.
Naturally, yeah. Nick, anything on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, BIM, we've obviously been using, you know, BIM on every single data center project we've done for probably about the last 12 years or something. So it's used very actively, but I think the industry doesn't use it to its fullest extent. I think there's still a lot of work to do to get more design input into BIM rather than just 3D modeling input, and that's something we're spending quite a bit of time on. And using more and more things, you know, we're starting to look at, you know, when we've got the model from a design perspective, you know, how can we make that model better and easier and more realistic to look through, both for ourselves and for our clients. And we're now starting to look at, you know, implementing augmented reality. So you put on a pair of goggles and you can effectively walk through the model and you can see where everything is. Does it work for space, layout, maintenance, and so on and so forth. So I think there are, you know, further improvements coming along the line there. And then very much, you know, agree with Ed that there does seem to be a bit of a breakdown where, you know, we'll put a lot of effort into, you know, producing a BIM Revit model. And there seems to be a tendency for the contractors not to take that on, but then break that down into different models that their various subcontractors use and then rebuild it again at the end, which doesn't seem the most effective and efficient way of doing things. So I think there's definitely opportunities for improvement there.
A whole panel discussion on the continuity, the use of BIM through construction and indeed operations, because, you know, it's another area which is, you know, essential. It should be a you know, a
and very much
tool.
It should be continuing through into the you know, into the operations. That the BIM model is something that the ops team use actively on a day-to-day basis to run the site.
Yeah. Okay. All right, great. Actually, Nick and Ed, sorry to ask you guys the same question, but since you've got the same specialism, it seems the right thing to do. I'd just like to switch subjects now and talk a little bit about IT load densities and how we've seen them increase, and you know, what do we think we're going to be seeing in terms of IT load densities increasing, or whatever you think they're going to do in the next 5 years or so, and indeed, what impact will that have on the infrastructure? So Ed first.
Okay, thanks. Well, obviously at the moment we're looking, you know, between 5 to 10 kilowatt loadings on a rack. But my kind of feeling is that's 20 kilowatt with the implementation of 5G coming down the line and the high density chips that are being created by the manufacturers. 20 is going to be the norm. I think you'll be pushing up to 30s and 40s very soon. Of course, that puts a strain not only on the mechanical cooling of these systems, but also the electrical input as well, which I think kind of gets overlooked a little bit by us mechanical engineers when we talk about that amount of power. What we can cool is how that's going to be actually supplied. I think it will have a massive phase change on how we cool data centers. I do believe that we'll be looking away from air and chilled water cooling. There's only so much limitations those systems have. And the move towards immersive coolings and direct chip cooling, I think, will become a lot more cost effective and just more popular throughout the whole industry. And then that goes on to other things of what you can do with that heat you generate and whether you can recapture it, whether you can reuse it. It's a way of looking at bringing our carbon footprint down in that sense, reducing the usage of coal and oil and gas-fired boilers on communities if we can. I know in Scandinavia and in some places in the Netherlands they're already doing that. or even preheating water for heat pumps. So I think that's where the technology should be going. I think it will go. I think rack densities will go up, and we will have to utilize that heat rather than just throwing it away.
Hey Nick, so I know you've got some thoughts on this. What's your sense in terms of, you know, step change perhaps, or maybe incremental change in terms of cooling technologies?
So yeah, I agree. We're currently sort of looking largely at sort of 5 to 10 kilowatts a rack, some a little bit larger. And I think the issue sort of becomes, you know, you can stick a huge amount in a rack and still cool it quite happily with air. But the issue then becomes how many racks you've got. And once you start getting up into much higher densities, it becomes a problem of how much air you can get in the cold aisle without getting excessive velocities that then create negative pressures in parts of the aisle and overheating. And yet, you know, the way you get around that from air cooling is you just start making your aisles wider to get more air in, but then that kind of defeats the object because you're getting more density, but you're still having to create a bigger data center because of the space you need for airflow. So I agree with Ed that for me, the future is moving towards direct liquid cooling. I feel we're very much in the hands of the IT manufacturers, and it requires them to start thinking and making that change. But I believe it's a necessity for the data center industry to go that way. You probably quadruple the load in a rack by going to direct liquid cooling, either on-chip cooling or immersion chip cooling, which is effectively having a chassis where the server sits in a chassis that's filled with a dielectric fluid, provides cooling. And if you've got 4 times the load in a rack, it means you need a quarter of the number of the racks for the same load in a data center, which means your data hall can be a quarter of the size. The space required for your mechanical cooling equipment is dramatically reduced, and overall you probably reduce your data center to half the size. So that's, you know, that's reduced cost, reduced program, and reduced embodied carbon. And then, as Ed says, the whole thing's so much more energy efficient. You know, you're cooling water for these direct liquid cooling systems, typically running with a flow temperature at about 40 degrees C. So that's a really hot bath, and that's the cooling water. The return water is probably 46 degrees C, and that's good heat that you can sell and reuse, which, you know, hopefully get us to the point where actually it's a fully circular energy system where we're not wasting any energy at all.
When do you think we're going to see this? What is effectively, I mean, in terms of the mainstream, a step change?
So we're seeing experimental projects at the moment, but I think you'd call them experimental projects. It's small halls of this kind of thing here and there. I believe it needs the hyperscalers, the big hyperscalers, and that's predominantly the big three are Google, Microsoft, and Amazon Web Services. To really start driving this, because I feel that they drive an awful lot of the technology in the data center industry, and in some cases they even make their own servers, so they've got the ability to team up with the right technical specialists and maybe start implementing this themselves. It's not going to happen overnight. I'd be disappointed if this wasn't fairly commonplace in 5 years' time.
Okay, now that's.
If I could just interject as well, I agree with Nick on the hyperscalers, but I do feel there's building stock now, data center stock, that is becoming past its sell by date, and it will need to be refurbished now. And again, agreeing with what Nick said in terms of your footprint being approximately 30 to 40% less space requirements, there may be these smaller data halls that can only do potentially 1 to 2 megawatts. That could actually be increased to do a good 4 or 5 at the same footprint, and therefore the local colos will start looking at maybe implementing this as well, because it's just they can get more capacity in their system on the same footprint of an existing building. It saves knocking a building down and all the embodied energy that goes with that if you can change the cooling requirements and increase the load.
Gordon, I'll turn to you. Very few people have got as much experience of you as you have in this industry. I know that you've developed some products for the risk management insurance programs for your clients, and I'm interested to know now, you know, as we continue to move from on-prem technology, use your own technology, the huge transition to hyperscale, IT, outsourced IT services, and so on. What do you think we need from these organizations, hyperscalers, and not just necessarily the big three? There are many, many other organizations that are rarely talked about, which are multi-billion-dollar organizations offering IT, outsourced IT services. What do you think is going to be needed from these providers? Because one word comes to mind in my here, and that's risk. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so we know over the last several years, a lot of the highly regulated service sectors are kind of built up risk management organizations, and these have kind of grown out of, I'm going to say, financial disasters of the past, or management issues, and other kind of environmental disasters. Okay, so you kind of got these big risk organizations that exist, and I think up until now they've really been looking at managing the risk and compliance and kind of internal audit points from within their own organizations and their own operations. But as more of this moves to the outsourced and using the hyperscalers and other colos, I mean, there's a large number out there, then I think we're going to see this move from clients doing their due diligence and placing a service level contract in place to actually needing a more transparent operation to satisfy their own internal audit and compliance, and in some cases maybe even external regulators who are saying, well, you're migrating these types of businesses and activities out, how are you managing the risk and the insurance, and how do you know that they're delivering to the SLAs and KPIs that you've established? Right. And I think that I certainly get a sense that colos and these big operators are working with clients, but I don't think from an industry point of view they're geared to really offer that transparency. It's more based on the size of the relationship than necessarily having a process to kind of feed those corporate needs. And I think that's going to be a change in the future.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I completely agree with you. I mean, at the moment, service level agreements are written, they're subscribed to, they're contractually binding, but at the end of the day, SLA aside, the risk still resides with the organization that's outsourced. So, if you're FCA regulated, for example, and you choose to outsource, you don't outsource the risk. You just, yes, you've got an SLA, but at the end of the day, you're still accountable. So when you say transparency, what does that mean? Give me an example. Tell us what practically that might mean.
Practically today, if and a lot of the colos and a lot of the big operators are good at working with big corporates, their representatives, people like myself and others. But, their way of working is generally about kind of answering your Q&A and not necessarily giving you the information, but maybe having sight of it. And, when you talk about the type of businesses that they're trying to engage in and contract with, I think longer term, there's just got to be a more technical solution that actually allows, let's say, an API interface to actually be able to draw down on data. And for these organizations to know that, you are doing your quarterly maintenance, that you have had these incidents and you've managed them, and just that operational visibility. And through that, it drives more trust as well.
All right, good. Right, just changing gears a minute. Kevin, coming back to you, please. What do you think will be the main challenges for our industry in data centers over the next few years? What are your thoughts on that, Kevin?
I think there's two components of challenges that I foresee. One, I think we're beginning to see already. It's data centers are obviously all about connectivity, and there's been a lot of focus on the FLAP locations, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, and Paris, and that's spreading out a little bit further now, but there's still a huge demand in those areas. And what we're seeing is that there are countries, there are municipalities putting moratoriums on data center development because the power and water demands of those data centers are a significant percentage of what those municipalities have to offer. So I think that's one area, the development of data centers in localities that are strained with regard to the utilities they can provide. The other is in relation to population growth around the world, really taking a global view of it. The United Nations sees by 2100, the population of Africa growing by 3 billion and the population of Asia growing by 1 billion. So if data centers are a mechanism for connectivity, there's a huge amount of development over the next 80 years. I know that's pretty far down the road, but that needs to be satisfied. And those locations are, I suppose, not to be too broad brush, but the power demands and the water demands that will be put on those localities will be a massive strain on them. So I think they're the two key issues I see with regard to the challenges for data centers in the future.
Okay, I've got now just a few general questions for you guys, so please jump in as you see fit. I mean, I'll just throw this out there. If you think about some of the usage of data centers, I mean, you know, you've got data centers doing productive, necessary work, and then you could argue an awful lot of work that data centers are doing, power consumed by data centers, is gratuitous. In other words, you know, sharing your photos with your friends, you know, constantly messaging on WhatsApp and so all of this is consuming data, it's consuming power. Anyone got any views on the future of that stuff? Do you think that we can continue to build data centers for that type of gratuitous use, as I see it anyway, unabated, or how do you see that going? Just throw that out there, guys. Anyone?
I'll dive in. I think that if anything, it's going to get social media. When you think of even our programs on TV nowadays, everyone is down streaming Netflix and Disney Plus, whatever channel they want. My kind of gut feeling is it will increase exponentially, and I hope, would like to see that every new housing development has its own small little power center on there, data center on it, which could be used as the generation for that area. So you're closer to your core audience, and also the heat you're pushing out can be used locally.
Well, just let me put this to you.
So maybe that's the way to do it. So they're smaller.
I hope it's your end, not my end. Can everyone else hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine, Ed.
Oh, good. Okay, thank God. I thought it was me. Look, so Kevin, this goes back to a discussion you and I were having on Friday, really. I mean, you know, Kevin put it to me, and forgive me if I paraphrase this incorrectly, I'm sure you'll tell me. But, you know, can you look at a situation perhaps a couple of generations down the line where our grandchildren are looking at us and saying, hey, you know, remember those days when you just could Google whatever you want, or you could send any message you want or any video. There was practically no cost associated, by which time, you know, arguably a lot of the natural resources of the planet will be further depleted. Don't you see, or does anyone kind of have a vision of the industry and its kind of free-for-all use of data being in some way curtailed at some point in time? Kevin, maybe you can chirp in, because I think that's basically what we were talking about the other day, right?
Yeah, so I think up until this point, the increase in efficiency of data centers has offset their growth, more or less. So it hasn't been immediately detrimental. That was a vision I had, where can we justify further down the road the amount of growth that is going to take place from here on in? And my thoughts on that are that data centers need to be a fulcrum for sustainable development. They can't just operate within the boundaries they're currently operating within. Ed touched on it there. They need to be part of the circular economy. You know, if you think of the edge data centers, the fact that data centers are going to be located everywhere, whether they're big or small, there's an opportunity there to close couple those data centers with the development of localities. So the waste of one facility is the fuel for another, and they can work in multiple different directions. If you think of you know, we always talk about district heating, you know, connecting the data center into that, but think of it the other way around. If you've got water treatment plants, or sewage treatment plants, and the production of energy from waste, you know, that could be used to feed into a circular economy. So I think we need to see the opportunities rather than necessarily just trundle along the same path over the next few years.
Nick, Ed, maybe you want to chirp in, or anyone for that matter, guys. I mean, let me ask you another question, throw that into the same kind of question I asked you before, is metrics wise, we've had, you know, PUE around for a while, WE, UE, CUE. What do you think we're going to be seeing in terms of new metrics, and why are we going to be seeing them?
I think we definitely are going to need some new metrics. I personally think PUE has been excellent. It's been highly abused by pretty much all parties, but it has resulted in, you know, a bit of competition to really drive down energy use, increase energy efficiency. And if we look where we used to be, you know, 10 years or so ago, you know, typical PUE was sort of 2 to 2.5, and now it's probably about 1.2 for a new data center. So, you know, that's an 85% reduction in the non-IT energy in that data center. So it's a massive reduction, and it then becomes difficult to reduce it very much more than that. There are some further benefits. Direct liquid cooling I mentioned earlier would bring some, you know, a further significant benefit. But it then gets into, yeah, what do the new metrics need to be? And I think we need metrics, and there are metrics out there, you know, carbon metrics, renewable energy metrics, you know, an overall sort of almost an environmental impact metric for a data center. We're starting to think not so much in terms of zero carbon, but zero environmental impact, whereby you locally manage the impact of a project. So where do you get your energy from? Is it locally renewably produced energy? Where does your waste go? You know, how much waste is there from site? Hopefully virtually none. But does it go, is it managed and dealt with locally, if it is, and reducing impact in that way.
Okay, guys, so what about embodied energy? We haven't talked about that at all. I personally think that's a big deal. So where are we going with that? Don't we need a metric for that?
I think we do. Again, as recently, well, I indicated earlier that the new building stock or existing building stock will need to be refurbished. Well, there's a kind of with BREEAM schemes in the past, and I know there's ones for data centers, but it's always went down the line of reusing what you can. And I think there's got to be some form of reuse on building stock at least, even if we can't reuse the technology that we have inside it. And again, I agree with Nick about energy usage. If we can locally produce it, and where maybe that be on wind farms or maybe that be for solar, the reality being is that the battery technology is growing, and that will help as well. So metrics about how you create your energy and how your carbon usage and your water usage. Water is the biggest driver. At the moment, we're using gallons and gallons for data centers, and that has to stop really, because it's just 1% of our energy, our carbon emissions are from water cleaning, which is about 5 million tons of carbon dioxide pumped in just for cleaning water. So if we can come away from that, again, water usage effectiveness, that has to be a part and parcel of the metrics as well.
Of course,
coming back to your embodied carbon there, Ed, I think it's absolutely crucial now that there has been a huge focus on carbon emissions from energy consumption for quite a long time now, and as we've said, some good improvements made, but embodied carbon has been largely ignored, and it is a major factor, and it's something that, so in order to be able to do something about it, you need to know how much embodied carbon is in your project, and it's information that's quite difficult to get. We've been doing a lot of work on this over the last year or so. We're about to launch a consultancy service, an embodied carbon service, where we'll work through with clients and tell them how much embodied carbon is in their project, and then suggest ways of how they could achieve, largely the same similar project, but with a lower embodied carbon content. I think that's going to be important going forwards.
I mean, surely,
I think it comes down to the construction side as well. I know prefabrication has been tried, but good modularization and reduction of waste in there on how we do things, and the transporting of equipment when it only needs to be transported once, rather than transport a lot of stuff to site to create the services you need, the systems you need, to then take the waste away and get rid of that waste. Again, it's the carbon usage from that alone is immense. So stopping the amount of stuff we transport, again, that would help, and that makes
yeah, okay. Let me come back to Andy, because I feel that this is an area that he may have a view. Andy, what are your thoughts in terms of what the guys have been saying in embodied energy? You have any ideas?
Well, I was just touching there about modularization and that type of thing. I think that modular builds and containerized builds have got so many positives, but again, it's coming from a delivery aspect of QA management, actually getting a good quality build in a shorter period of time under different management and different control measures. However, just touching on what you're talking about there about mainly sustainability, is you're double delivering a lot of these materials. You're delivering them once to where it's actually being fabricated, then you're picking up that complete unit and then you're shipping it out, which could be anywhere in Europe. So there's pros and cons with it. I mean, we used to do a lot of modular builds years back, and it was like shipping thin air, basically. Once you've got that white space complete, you're shipping thin air. Yeah,
I get it. I mean, this is the thing with embodied energy. It's wide ranging. It really does start at excavation stage, when the minerals are pulled from the ground. And transportation is obviously a significant factor. So again, and it's sort of a general question for the panel, on-site generation. Okay, it's all very well buying renewables. That's all very well buying renewables, but there is a finite amount of renewable energy available in the market at any one time. So you could argue, if you're buying renewable energy from an energy service provider, you're probably depriving somebody else from buying renewable energy. Surely the argument is on-site generation, but what does that mean? And what are your views on what does that mean in terms of the industry? Is it something that we're going to see? I mean, clearly, there are areas that are more predisposed to this than others. I want to just turn to Gordon a minute. I mean, you've got any thoughts on that one, Gordon?
Yeah, I mean, local generation has always been a challenge. I mean, there are sites out there that do make use of methane, etc., because it's locally accessible from sites. A lot of studies going on out there about future generations, some quite exciting work, if not early days, based on old ideas, but with the emergence of technology, it makes stuff that once couldn't be made to work a viable possibility for the future. Scalability and energy density still remains a problem pretty much for all those kind of new ideas beyond what we currently know about and are executable today. But exciting times ahead if any of these kind of emerge. And you got things like gas synthesis from using the sun, okay, so using UV to produce like fuels. And there's other stuff out there. I mean, there's molten salt, okay, not some issues with that. But personally, quite excited about what's happening in the battery space with battery technology. And of course, Tesla made some announcements last week on their batteries for motor vehicles. And, we've got supercapacitors coming up as well. So all these things give us, I'm going to say, a roadmap to a future that may improve efficiencies, but obviously need investment and a lot more development. And then, of course, adoption of emerging technology. And that can be challenging, especially in a risk-averse environment.
Yes. Okay. So what about the rest of the panel? Your thoughts on on-site generation?
I wonder, Ed, whether it almost goes back to your earlier question about how much can we continue to use data, and I agree with the other Ed that it will rise, it will continue to rise exponentially, and I don't think there will be any stopping it. And so data centers will, they will need to continue to be built But I do wonder whether there's a case for some legislation coming in somewhere down the line, which basically says if you're going to build a data center, you need to create some on-site renewables. 25% of your capacity must be able to be delivered from on-site renewables. So you buy a plot of land for your data center, and you buy extra land and you put renewable power generation on that land, so you've got local renewable. Because as you say, I think it was about 28% of global grid electricity production is renewable at the moment, which means 72% isn't, which is not enough to go around.
Yeah, so it does in a way blend into the nation's commitment to climate change at a national level and an international level. I mean, I don't know. I think it also blends into metrics. So, guys, look, thank you very much for your time. I just really wanted to go back around each one of you and see whether there are some other points that I haven't raised or questions that I haven't raised that you'd like to mention. Can I start with you, Andy?
Yeah, sorry. Just your thoughts on something regarding, obviously I mentioned before about the whole the pandemic and changes that are kind of being forced on day-to-day activities going forward. And it's the factory acceptance tests. Obviously on a typical project, you could be dealing with testing in numerous different countries. And it's the remote testing that is currently being discussed, and I think it's something that's going to have to be implemented going forward. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll dive in on that one if that's okay. Again, we're doing this whole thing on Zoom. We've got real time. People can talk to each other. We've had meetings. When Deerns were doing large work in Scandinavia, I would be talking to my engineers on site. They'd have a problem. They just ping me a line. We'd go on VC and we'd talk it through. We could share things. I see no reason why future testing of any equipment can't be done remotely. It could be done at the factory. There doesn't need to ship out 3 or 4 engineers and clients using air fuel and all the carbon that gets pushed from there, where the factory itself could have a guy with a camera and they could be dictated or directed to looking at graphs coming in and readings. I see no reason to be visiting sites for testing. For product examination, that's another story, but for actual physically testing a piece of equipment, there's no reason for it.
Yeah, you raised an interesting point. There's no.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, we've started using augmented reality to kind of support initiatives which include, performance testing of buildings, problem management, remote diagnosis. So totally concur.
Okay, and just going around again, Gord, is that it for you, or you wanted to add anything else on that? To closing remarks.
I think closing remark. Just want to recognise all the operational teams. I know we're on the call here by Zoom, and I would imagine that most of us can remotely work. But obviously, we've got these data centres and other critical environments that teams continue to operate day and night under some quite difficult conditions when you think about the global market, not just the UK market. So just a shout out for them guys that keep that stuff on, all right, and fix the problems. We get to work from home.
Yeah, thanks. Good call. Good. Nick, any final thoughts?
I think I would just sort of reiterate the point about a net zero environmental impact on projects and managing energy and waste and so on locally as possible to achieve that. It would be nice to see some of the bigger companies starting to drive this themselves. Ultimately, I suspect it might come down to legislation if that doesn't happen. But it'd be good if we got that moving, within the industry itself a bit more.
Absolutely. And Ed?
Well, I go back to Zoom meetings. We're doing this, we're home working. I do believe this is going to be the new norm. Therefore, data will be generated at vast volumes locally. And again, I think there is legislation should be done for looking at reducing the amount of energy, keeping the data centers nearer to to actual people, rather than just being in the field somewhere miles away, where you've got massive hyperscales. I like the ideas of smaller, more dense DCs, and again, that's the way forward in my mind, along with other technologies like fuel cells, but that's for another day. So
yeah, we ran out of time, didn't get to those. Look, finally, Kevin.
I suppose from my perspective, we just got to bear in mind there are very different types of data centers. There are small 25 kilowatt telco facilities. There are mega scale campuses. One size does not fit all. There are solutions to all of them. In the past, we've probably been guilty of suggesting that the broader sustainability issue is difficult to, or is insignificant compared to the energy related issues. It completely outweighed everything else in a lot of people's heads. But now we're in the situation where a lot of the cloud players are committing to be carbon neutral from a power perspective. Once that happens, all of the other sustainability issues become more important, such as embodied carbon and water and so on. So we have the opportunity, as you were talking about earlier, now to apply direct renewables on site. It's been fobbed off in the past because it was perceived to be too small a percentage of the overall power. But if you've got a 25 kilowatt facility, it's easy to support that with renewables. And there's battery technology now that can make that happen. So I guess my hope for the future is that we reassess our beliefs for data centers, because we have the opportunity to really change the game over the next few years.
Very good. Well, firstly, to the people listening to the panel, just to let you know that this is pre-recorded, and that in a short time we'll continue with questions when the panel goes live. But in the meantime, just leaves me to thank you all very much for the contribution you've made to the panel today, and speak to you all soon, I hope. Okay, take care.
thank you, Ed.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.